Hi everyone, welcome to Miss Adams Teaches English Language and Literature A-Level. This video is going to focus on comparing Othello and The Great Gatsby for the Edexcel Paper 2 Section B. I'm going to focus in on the theme of identity. Now that is an enormous theme and obviously you've only got an hour and a bit to write this essay. So I'd really strongly recommend that if you're writing an essay on identity or any of these essays that come up, you find an angle rather than trying to cover loads of different ideas and sort of bouncing around superficially. You take a line of argument and develop it thoroughly. That's what I'm going to do for you today. And I'm going to look entirely at the way that Othello and Gatsby, just those two characters, deliberately shape and build their identities before having them deconstructed, and then both of them attempting to reconstruct their identities, or have their identities reconstructed at the end, I should say. So I'm not dealing with all of the different characters. I will do a little bit at the end, just some honourable mentions, just to give you some food for thought. But in general, this is just going to focus on Othello and Gatsby themselves. So let's get started. Okay, so let's start by having a little look at how our titular characters actually present themselves. So this slide is all about the notion that a character can construct a sense of their own identity and decide how they are to be perceived. So I'm going to start off with Gatsby. So this two little sections for you here that are really worth pulling apart. And this is all about the moment where James Gatz created the notion of J. Gatsby. It talks about when he sees Dan Cody in trouble. It says it was James Gatz that was loafing along the beach, but it was J. Gatsby that took the boat out, which tells us that Fitzgerald wants us to see Gatsby as a complete construction of self, a conscious decision. And then this little section here that I've given you is about that formulation of that sense of self. So Fitzgerald writes, "The truth was that J. Gatsby of West Egg, Long Island, sprang from his Platonic conception of himself. He was a son of God, a phrase which, if it means anything, means just that. He must be about his father's business, the service of a vast, vulgar and meretricious beauty." So this idea, this allusion to Plato and Plato's cave with the Platonic conception of himself is all about the notion of creating an ideal self. And so Fitzgerald tells us very specifically here through this allusion and through the references to Jesus being the Son of God, that this is about creating a dream version of himself, and that dream version is J. Gatsby. And note again here, so he invented just the sort of J. Gatsby that a 17-year-old boy would be likely to reinvent, because that is James Gatz dreaming. So all of the kind of madness and the excess and the impossibilities of J. Gatsby come because it was an invention of James Gatz, who was 17. And then you've got this sort of inversion, I suppose, of Christ here, because it's talking about going about his father's business, which is of course spreading the gospel, but in this case the business is this inversion of it. It's a vast, vulgar and meretricious beauty. It's about excess, conspicuous consumption. So yeah, a very clear sense of self and identity being constructed. But Fitzgerald also points to the difficulties and the challenge and the harm that comes with that. So this is from the same chapter where it talks, and this is describing James Gatz and his sort of turmoil and his anguish, dreaming of being someone else. His heart was in a constant turbulent riot. So wonderful metaphor and hyperbole there. The most grotesque and fantastic conceits haunted him in his bed at night. A universe of ineffable gaudiness spun itself out in his brain while the clock ticked on the washstand, another reference to time. And the moon soaked with wet light his tangled clothes upon the floor. Each night he added to the pattern of his fancies until drowsiness closed down. Okay, so again, you can see this very deliberate crafting of self. But this idea of who he should be is yeah, it haunts him, obviously the metaphor there, this idea of being disappointed. So, you know, Jay Gatsby has this sort of sense of grandeur, you know, this overinflated sense of self, but it's because of how little he had as a 17-year-old boy, that he does this, and he torments himself with this idea of construction. Now, you can draw a similarity to Othello in as much as you can say that there is deliberate crafting of identity, but it's with less pain, it's with less suffering, it's a slightly more natural construction of self. Obviously, there is this idea of Othello kind of changing his path in terms of how he is perceived. And this little moment that I'm giving you here comes from Act 1, Scene 3, where he's asked to defend his love and his sort of relationship with Desdemona. But I think it's really interesting the way he presents himself. So this is a presentation of self, and he's already positioned himself as being inferior to them. I haven't put this on the speech, but on the slide, but when he uses superlative adjectives pointing out their status, so most reverend signors, he refers to them as masters. And then he says here, rude am I in my speech, and little blessed with the soft phrase of peace. So he apologizes for his lack of eloquence here, ironically, whilst being excessively eloquent and crafted. Shakespeare uses hyperbaton here, which is an inversion of the syntax, to place the focus on the adjective rude, which is, again, it's Othello being self-deprecating, presenting himself as lower. But then what he does is he reminds everyone about everything he has done in battle. For since these arms of mine had 7 years pith, 7 years strength, so since he was 7 years old, till now some 9 moons wasted, they have used their dearest action in the tented field. And little of this great world can I speak. Again, look at that, this great world. He means their world. You know, I don't have experience of your world here, because all I've done is fight. Okay, more than pertains to feats of broil and battle. And therefore little shall I grace my cause in speaking for myself. But what he is doing there is reminding the council of his warrior status. So he is constructing his sense of self and presenting his sense of self as the warrior hero. Now, they need the warrior hero, don't they? Because they're about to go into war, that's actually the reason that they've sent for him in the first place. So actually what he's doing is he's reminding them, flattering them, lowering himself, but also reminding them of how much they need him. So by constructing his sense of self as I am the warrior hero, it actually allows him to get what he wants, which is Desdemona. And we're also reminded of, although again the self-deprecation, he's saying that he is not eloquent, of actually how eloquent he is. Not only do we have the hyperbaton here, but we have this wonderful metaphor. I will a round unvarnished tale deliver of my whole course of love. So this metaphor of a table, yeah, unvarnished round. So he's saying, I won't elaborate. I won't, you know, gloss it up. I will give you the truth. And that's how he's known. So this is obviously an identity that comes with him. What's also interesting about the way he presents himself and his sense of self is that he's not truthful about his origins, about his roots. He says to Iago, when boasting is an honour, I shall promulgate. So he's saying, if there's a time when boasting is okay, then I'll tell everyone that I fetch my life and being from men of royal siege, and my demerits may speak on bonnet too, as proud of fortune as this I have reached. So hang on a minute, he's saying to Iago, oh, actually, I am actually royalty. I'm of royal birth. You know, that's where my family are royalty. And actually, I am just as high status as Desdemona when he says to as proud of fortune as this that I have reached. That demonstrative determiner there, this. Oh no, pronoun, sorry, he's actually referring to Desdemona. He's saying, I am equal to her, yet he chooses not to say. He says it would be boasting. That's not boasting. So this is again about construction of self. He chooses which parts of himself to show the world. Now this is also perhaps a hint towards his hamartia, which is, I think, people may disagree with me, his insecurity, the fact that he doesn't let himself believe that he can fit into this world because of his race and because of his age. And so perhaps in this moment, what we are seeing is that it's his insecurity that stops him from showing people his true status in case they reject him, in case they don't value it, in case they don't see it. But clearly he is wanting the world to see this projection of himself as simply the warrior, as the soldier. And it's his warrior status, his soldier status, that makes him worthy of Desdemona's love, not actually his origins. So that was focusing on the construction of self, construction of identity. In both texts, there is also a moment where our protagonists, Othello and Gatsby, have their sense of self deconstructed, the destabilizing of their sense of self. And it comes because of threat to their, so you could almost look at it in terms of threatening acts, but when their sense of self and their sense of identity is threatened, in both cases, it's obliterated. Starting with Gatsby. So we're going to look at a couple of moments from first off the plaza scene. So obviously his sense of self is threatened by Tom. Tom says, I suppose the latest thing is to sit back and let Mr. Nobody from nowhere make love to your wife. So Gatsby's identity is this very, very rich, very, very well-to-do. Yes, quite ostentatious, but he's presenting himself as this very, very rich and wealthy person. And he does lie about where he's from and his parents, because we see him do that to Nick. So when Tom refers to him as Mr. Nobody from nowhere, with nobody and nowhere capitalized to make them proper nouns, so ironically creating heritage out of nobody and nowhere, it is essentially threatening that presentation of self. And because of that, and the truths that come out about Gatsby's money and where he's come from and his connections with Wolfsheim and everyone, you can see him start to unravel. And that's what we see here. At past, he began to talk excitedly to Daisy, denying everything, defending his name against accusations that had not been made. Now, this is really interesting because Fitzgerald moves into reported speech here, whereas previously everything else had been in direct speech. So it's almost like Gatsby becomes less powerful and less significant, and that is demonstrated through the use of reported speech here. And there's a sort of erratic, kind of impulsive description here, denying everything, defending his name against accusations that had not been made. It's irrational. And although I've not put the slide on, Daisy starts to go further and further within herself. So because of this realization of the truth, because of this sense, like this deconstruction of sense of self, in the next chapter, Fitzgerald gives us this spectacular metaphor to describe the complete and utter obliteration of identity. It was this night that he told me the strange story of his youth with Dan Cody. Told it to me because Jay Gatsby had broken up like glass against Tom's hard malice, and the long secret extravaganza was played out. I think he would have acknowledged everything now without reserve, but he wanted to talk about Daisy. So we've got this simile here. Jay Gatsby had broken up like glass, but the whole thing is a metaphor because it's describing Jay Gatsby as a breakable thing, and we've got Tom's hard malice as well. So it's Tom's cruelty, it's Tom's willingness, well, I mean, it's Tom's truth, but it's Tom's cruelty that does it. And the notion of Jay Gatsby is obliterated, which means that finally he can be truthful. And that's why we learn the story of James Gatz and how his identity was created, because it has been obliterated. And in Othello, making a comparison, which again is a similarity, we get this notion of identity, sense of self being obliterated. Look at this speech. This is very early on in this is Act 3, Scene 3, so very early on in the manipulations, when he believes, when he considers the idea that other men might have tasted the sweet body of Desdemona. This is what he says. Farewell the tranquil mind, farewell content, farewell the plumed troop and the big wars that make ambition virtue. Oh, farewell, farewell the neighing steed and the shrill trump, the spirit-stirring drum, the ear-piercing fife, the royal banner and all quality, pride, pomp, circumstance of glorious war. Farewell, Othello's occupation has gone. So we talked in the previous slide about the fact that his identity is based on the notion of him being a war hero or a warrior. The moment that his sense of self is threatened, the idea of being cuckolded by Desdemona, what he is saying goodbye to is images of war. Okay, so we've got a semantic field of war here, but notice as well, it's all of the pomp and circumstance of glorious war. It's all about the appearance of war. It's about identity. And because he has constructed himself out of this notion, when he believes that Desdemona has cheated on him, his whole sense of self is shattered. Othello's occupation is gone. And obviously this is reiterated through Shakespeare's beautiful use of rhetoric. We've got the anaphoric construction of these exclamative sentences with a repetition of farewell. And you can also say that across a few lines you've also got anadiplosis, because you've got farewell here, you've got farewell at the top, you've got farewell at the bottom. And then if you notice, all of the semantic field of war, almost all of it, is then all of these, they're pre-modified by adjectives that are to do with kind of excitement and sound and the visuals. It's all about the, like I said, the show of war, the appearance of war. All of that, his identity is gone. And much later on in the play, after he has struck Desdemona and been quite, again, irrational, impulsive, erratic, the goats and monkeys bit, Lodovico turns to Iago and says, "Is this the noble war whom our full senate call all in all sufficient? Is this the nature whom passion could not shake, whose solid virtue the shot of accident nor dart of chance could neither graze nor pierce?" So Shakespeare here is giving Lodovico all of these rhetorical questions that demonstrate how shaken he is in his perception of Othello, because he, like the whole Senate, bought into the idea of this strong and solid man who was such a good warrior because passion didn't shake him, because he was together and in control. And now when he sees the new Othello, he too recognizes that that sense of who he was, the identity that Othello had built, has gone. In fact, Iago's next line is, he is much changed. So again, this idea that who he once was has now tumbled down. And in both texts, both of the titular characters, both of our protagonists, have this moment where their identity, or former identity perhaps, is reconstructed. Going to Gatsby first. Now, this is a difference, although similarity, both of our titular characters have this sense of their identity being reconstructed after the obliteration. But the difference is who is doing it. Okay, so it is Nick that is reconstructing Gatsby's identity, where it's Othello that does it for himself. So nice little difference within the similarity. But have a little look at this. On the last night with my trunk packed and my car sold to the grocer, I went over and looked at that huge incoherent failure of a house once more. On the white steps, an obscene word scrawled by some boy with a piece of brick stood out clearly in the moonlight, and I erased it, drawing my shoe raspingly along the stone. So obviously this is so metaphorical, this is so symbolic. So if you've watched any of my other Gatsby videos, particularly on the chapter 1 video, you'll know that houses and settings, but houses in particular, are really symbolic for sense of self and identity. So Gatsby's house is like a mirror image of him. So at the very beginning of the book, the house is described as being certainly very, very grand, but it's very much a symbol of the newness and the kind of brashness of new money. It's got, you know, a thin beard of ivy as opposed to the bright vines that Tom Buchanan has. It's a colossal affair and it's a factual imitation. So the house is very much a symbol of Gatsby himself. And after Gatsby's identity has been shattered by Tom's hard malice, when they go back to the house whilst Gatsby is still alive, they talk about it, and it's all dark and dusty and it's almost like ash, and they're kind of like fumbling around, and it's about like showing the idea of Gatsby being sort of like identity-less, like a ghost, like quite a parallel to the Valley of Ashes. I might have just said that, sorry. And so now that Gatsby is dead, it's the huge incoherent failure of a house. So Gatsby's dream, Gatsby's sense of self, Gatsby's identity was a failure. It did not last. And note the personification of it as well, the incoherence. There's a sort of slight sense of it never making sense. But we've got the white steps, so a reminder of the kind of shiny outlook, the greatness of it, and unfortunately someone has scrawled an obscene word. So this is again like the deconstruction, and it is Nick that erases it. So it's like Nick erasing the bad from Gatsby's life, essentially allowing him to be great. And we must remember that Fitzgerald's book, which is Nick's book, is called The Great Gatsby. It is Nick that uses the epithet great to describe Gatsby. He is the one that is reconstructing him as great, scrawling away any bad words to leave the gleaming white of the house clean. Obviously very symbolic. In Othello, there is also an attempt to reconstruct identity and to come back to a kind of sense of greatness, but it is Othello that does it. Now, this is Act 5, Scene 2. After he's killed Desdemona and everything has been found out, and Iago's been found out, Lodovico comes in and says, "Where is this rash and most unfortunate man?" Very, very generous adjectives. He is giving Othello here. Most unfortunate. Yes, it is quite unlucky, isn't it, when you murder your wife? But look at what Othello says. That's he that was Othello. Here I am. So we've got past tense and third person. That's old Othello. Othello that was rash and unfortunate. He murdered his wife. And then we have here I am, present tense, first person perspective. Here I am. This is a different me. So you've got Othello at the beginning, then you've got rash, unfortunate Othello, and now you have new Othello. Here I am. And then in his last moments, he gets to reconstruct himself completely, where he instructs Lodovico and the other men how to describe him in his death. This has long been referred to as like the eulogy. But in this case, whereas most people have a eulogy written about them after their death, Shakespeare has Othello write his own before his death. And note even just things like the imperatives that he uses. Speak of me as I am. It also says later on, set you down thus. Then must you speak. So there's a real sense of control here. He's saying, this is what you must say. And then he gives this sort of list of who he is and how he should be remembered. He reminds people of how he has done the state some service, and then humbly says no more of that. So he's saying, I am the warrior, but I'm humble. And then he asks them to write down these unlucky deeds. Then must you speak of one that loved not wisely, but too well. It was that he loved Desdemona too much. He wasn't wise in it, but he loved her too much. That he was not easily jealous, but being wrought perplexed in the extreme. So not a jealous man. It's all on Iago. Of one whose hand, like the base Indian, threw a pearl away richer than all his tribe. Someone who didn't understand the worth of what he had. Quite right. Note again, here we have a return to the kind of eloquence that we saw in Act 1, Scene 3. So it's not just rebuilding himself, but it's also a return. Some people see this as a form of his ananeurisis, although I'm not sure I 100% agree. I do have a video coming away about tragic conventions across the two texts, so look out for that one. Excuse me. We have this rhetoric here. Again, we've got anaphoric construction, and we've got this real kind of balance in the utterances. And lots of antithesis. We've got further simile, metaphor here, threw a pearl away richer than all his tribe. But note how there is still an objectification of Desdemona. She is something that is to be valued in a monetary fashion. Note the way the enjambement falls on the comparative adjective richer, again reminding us of Desdemona's monetary value. You know. It's a trope of romance to compare women to jewelry, but when it comes down to it, that's what we have here. But what's really interesting, and I realise I don't have it on the slide, is that the final part of the speech before he kills himself is where he reminds them of the duty that he did in Aleppo, where he killed the turbaned Turk, and he says, as I did here. In this moment, the most important thing is that he's reminding them again of his warrior status. He rebuilds himself as someone who was always loyal to the state, that has done the state some service. So Nick reconstructs Gatsby as great. Othello reconstructs himself as great, but perhaps this also means that he doesn't quite have the same sort of epiphany or realization about what his flaws are. Everything I've just said there, crikey, I mean, there's enough for an essay in just those ideas, just tracing through those protagonists. But I'm just going to give you some honourable mentions, some other bits and pieces that I think are quite interesting in terms of identity. I think women is quite interesting across the two, because you've got, in Gatsby, you've got Myrtle, who has such a, just like Gatsby, and therefore just like Othello, there's a real sense of a deliberate construction of self. You know, she builds herself out of the Valley of Ashes. Valley of Ashes, it's almost like the identity of the Valley of Ashes is grey, and there's Myrtle in bright colours and polka dots. But just like Gatsby, her attempt ultimately fails, and she never manages to leave the world that she is in. She stays with blood mingled into the Valley of the Ashes themselves. What's interesting is that you could make a link to Othello here, but pointing out quite a stark difference, that whereas Myrtle is able to attempt to fashion her identity in a particular way, women don't get that chance in Othello. Their identities are shaped by the way they are perceived by men. You can see that perfectly through Desdemona. At the beginning, Desdemona is worshipped. She is the paragon of virtue and beauty. And despite the fact that that stays true the entire way, Othello's perception of her and who she is and what governs her is one of deceit, and that is because of the inherent misogynistic belief that women will deceive that was held at the time. So you've got this idea, and that is still the case in Gatsby. There is still a sense of the idea that it's through the way that men perceive women that they gain their kind of sense of identity and who they are, but they do have more freedom. Daisy has so many affectations. She too has built up her identity with her low, thrilling voice that everyone has to, you know, lean in to hear. So that's quite an interesting take. I think you can certainly compare Iago and Gatsby and this idea of this long-term strategy in building a false identity. So, you know, Othello is a soldier. You know, he is a warrior, but that's just what he wants to be seen as. That's what drives him forward. But Gatsby is not a rich man. Well, he becomes it, but he's not born from a rich family. It's a false identity, this J. Gatsby, just like Iago's identity of honest Iago. Check out the epithet honest that is repeated so many times. This is a long-term strategy, because just like in Gatsby, the identity was made before the text, the story of the text begins, so they can be compared. I've talked a lot about the idea of the self-fashioning of identity, the deliberate construction on behalf of yourself. But I did obviously mention in the last bit about how Nick is in charge of Gatsby's identity at the end in the construction of the book itself. But you could actually make a comparison to the way that Iago is almost like modelling Othello and creating a version of him that fits with the sort of Elizabethan Jacobean stereotype of the savage more. And so that actually, and you've got this wonderful phrase, I should have put it on, sorry, but Iagoization, that Othello becomes Iagoized, his identity starts to blur with Iago, and so when his language becomes more sort of taboo and the imagery becomes darker and more kind of crass, it's him sort of steadily becoming more like Iago. So you've got a comparison in that both characters are kind of shaped and molded by others, but Nick is trying to make Gatsby a version that is good, whereas Iago is trying to destroy Othello's sense of self. And then my last one is, I think, another quite interesting route into comparing Gatsby and Othello, and the way that they're perceived in their own sense of self is through the past, and in particular the influence of war. It's obvious how that has impacted upon Othello, as we have discussed through this video, but you can also look at the fact that it's Gatsby's experience of war that allows him to enter the door, you know, to enter the house, metaphorically and literally. That is Daisy Fay. You know, when he first meets her, it's because he's wearing the cloak of invisibility. That is his uniform, the one that strips him of class. That's it from me. Sorry, that was quite a long video, but identity is such a huge subject. It's difficult to do it quickly, and I've only just touched upon a few things, but this comes back, I think I said this at the beginning of the video as well. These questions that Edexcel poses are enormous. You have to have an angle. You cannot cover everything. You would be far better off going, I'm going to talk about the way that Othello and Gatsby construct and then reconstruct their own identities, and going deep dive into that, than trying to jump around and mention all sorts of lots of different things. Anyway, hope that was helpful. Give me a shout if you have any questions or you want to put anything to me, just pop them in the comments and I will get back to you. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching. Happy revising.